Hello everyone. The topic of this video is CSS Media Queries, which is a really important thing for making responsive web pages. Now, a responsive web page is one that responds to different screen sizes. So it will adapt its layout for small screens and for large screens. If you're not sure what that means, just sit tight and you'll see what I mean when we get through this activity. All right, so we've been working in the CSS folder here in VS Code. So go ahead and right click on the CSS folder and choose new file. And we'll call it media queries.html. Media queries.html. Okay, now what we're going to do for the starter code is we're going to grab the starter code that, or the code that we used back in HTML for our layout elements file. So what I want you to do here, I'm going to close the CSS folder, and then I'm going to open the HTML folder, and you should have this file if you've been following along, layout elements. Here it is. Here's all the code for it. We're going to copy all of it. So you can do Control A to copy it, or I'm sorry, to select it. Control A will select everything in there, and then Control C will copy all of it. And then we can go back over to our media queries file right here, which is empty, and we'll paste it in here like that with Control V. Okay, so some copy pasting maneuvers there. All right, so here's the code. Maybe you remember it, maybe not. Let's go ahead and change the title to say media queries. And let's open this page up in the browser right away. So I'm going to do Control S to save my changes, and then I'll do Alt B to open it in the browser. And here's what it looks like. Okay, so it's just a standard layout for a web page with a main content area and a sidebar, and also a nav bar, even though there's no links in there, but you can just imagine there might be links inside of there. And then a header and a footer. Okay, now I want to show you what happens on small screens. So I'm just going to take the browser window and I'm going to shrink it. So it starts to get to be, it's hard to tell here without content, but the sidebar is so thin that you could only fit a few words in there before they start to wrap. So this is going to be a problem. And there's a few other problems that we'll see and figure out how to deal with here too. So what we're trying to do is we want to make this page respond so that on big screens it looks like it originally did, and then we'll make some adaptations for smaller screens. Okay, now in order to do that, we're going to add what's called a CSS Media Query to the web page. So let's go back over to VS Code right here, and then find the style element where all the CSS code is. And let's scroll down to the bottom, the rule set that targets the footer. That's the last rule set. So I'm going to put my cursor after that closing curly brace there, and I want you to type in this code. Now I never really understood this syntax. It's very strange to me, but here's what I want you to type in right before the closing style tag. An @ sign, and then media, and then space, and then the word all, space, the word and, space, and now a pair of parentheses like that. And what we're going to do inside the parentheses is we're going to type in max-width colon 600px. Okay, and then at the end of that line, put a pair of curly braces and split them apart. Okay, now like I said, this syntax never really made a whole lot of sense to me, but what this means here, this is a media query, and what it means is that once the browser hits a maximum width of 600 pixels or less, then all the rule sets that we put inside of here, in other words, in between the curly braces right here and here, all the rule sets that we put inside of those will take effect. So you may want to add yourself a note right here. You can, I'm just above that line, I'm going to do Control / and that will put a comment in here. And then I'm just going to split those apart like that. And then for the comment, you can say the rule sets inside this media query will take effect when the browser screen, or maybe I should say window, when the browser window is a max of 600 pixels wide or less. Okay, all right, let's see how that works here. So we're going to put some rule sets inside of this media query here. So put your cursor inside the media query. Make sure you're indented. We want to indent everything that's inside of here so we can clearly see what's nested inside of it. And what we're going to do is use a group selector that targets the main element and the aside element. So our selector is going to look like this: main, comma, aside, and then a pair of curly braces. Okay, now what we're going to do for small screens is we want to go to a one-column layout. We have the main element and the aside element normally go side by side. That's how we set this thing up. But what we're going to do is make them stack vertically, and we're going to do it like this. First of all, we set the width for the main element to 70%. That's up above here. If I scroll up, the width was 70%. The width of the aside was 30%. What we're going to do is set both of those to 100 down here in our new rule set. So we're going to set the width to 100%. And then we're going to put a semicolon there. And now what we did to get those to stack side by side is we used the float property. Now I didn't cover that much because nowadays everybody's using Flexbox. But we set the float to left on those elements. And if you scroll up, you'll see what I mean. We want to set the float property back to its default and remove the floating. So we'll set float to none here. And now let's take a look at this. So save your changes. Then Alt-Tab back to the browser here and refresh the page. Now it won't look any different right now. But as I'm going to try and, as I shrink here, let me do it this way so I can gradually. All right, so here, once we hit our media query, in other words, once we hit 600 pixels, you'll see that the sidebar and the main content are going to stack. There it is right there. So the sidebar and the main content are now stacking vertically like they normally would as block level elements. Now I think what we did is we set the height to 400 pixels for each of them, and I just wanted them to take up some vertical space. Let's reverse that in our media query too. So back here, I'm going to go back here, and we want to go back to auto height. That's the default. So we'll set the height property to auto, and then we'll be able to see this a little bit better here. Save that. Go back to the browser and hit refresh, and there we go. So now they're just taking up as much space as they need to. So we're going from a 2-column layout for bigger screens to a 1-column layout for smaller screens. And the important thing to note here is that what we did here is we arranged these to stack side by setting their float property, and then we removed that. And we also set the width here to 70% and the width here to 30%. So once we go to a 1-column layout, we want them both to go back to 100%. Okay, now, so here you can see I'm hitting that breakpoint at 600 pixels. By the way, we set it to 600 pixels, and that's what they call a breakpoint. So we set a breakpoint at 600 pixels. That's where our media query is going to kick in right there. So right here, you can see I'm at about 600 pixels. Okay, so for small screens, we go to a 1-column layout. Now, a lot of times a nav bar could have many links, and they might not all fit on this small screen right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to hide the nav bar altogether once we hit our breakpoint at 600 pixels. Well, let's do that real quick here in the media query. So go down to the media query. Let's add another rule set right here. And let's target the nav element. So that'll be our selector nav. We'll set the display property to none, which will basically remove it from the layout altogether. Okay, so save that. Go back over to the browser, and before you refresh, I'm just going to stretch it out to greater than 600 pixels. And then I'm going to refresh the page here so it gets our changes. And now look what happens when I hit the breakpoint. The nav bar disappears. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, how do people navigate on a small screen? Well, what usually happens is a menu button will appear here or somewhere else on the page. Usually it's in the top right or left, and people can press the button or click on the button and it will make the menu appear. So we'll get that started here, and we'll actually finish that in another activity. But just to get us started right here, here's what we're going to do. Back over in VS Code, we're going to add an element that will be our button. Now we can add it right underneath the footer, and the reason why we can put it way down at the bottom is because we're going to use absolute positioning on it, and if you remember that from the previous activity. So underneath the closing footer tag, add a div, and we're going to give this div an ID of menu button so that we can target it with a selector. Okay, and now what we're going to put in it is one of those entity characters that I showed you back when we were talking about HTML odds and ends. So this is going to give us the menu icon that you'll recognize, but entity characters start with an ampersand and then usually some number. Actually, this one starts with an ampersand and then a hashtag and then 9976 semicolon. 9976 semicolon. So let's see what that looks like at the moment. So I'll save it and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and refresh. And now it's going to look funny. Did I pick the wrong number there? I picked the wrong number. Give me a second. That looks like a hockey skate. Okay, I messed up my numbers. It's actually 9776. So that's what it should be, 9776. Save that. Alt-Tab back to the browser here, refresh the page. There we go. It's kind of hard to see, but they call that a hamburger icon or a menu icon where it's just the 3 lines, and people should recognize it as if you click on it, it should show some sort of a menu. So, all right, now we're going to position it with absolute positioning, and we're going to move it to the top right corner, and we're going to apply some other CSS to it here too. So let's scroll back up to before our media query. So we're going to set its properties up here before the media query just so we can have a look at it, and then we'll put some more code in the media query. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to use an ID selector, so hashtag menu dash button, then our curly braces, and we're going to set the position to absolute so that we can position it absolutely relative to the top and right sides of the browser window. Okay, I spelt that wrong, so I have to fix that. There we go. And now that we've set position to absolute, we can use a top property. So we'll set the top to 0px, and then we'll set the right property to 0px also, like that. Okay, and then while we're at it, let's just set the background color to gray so it makes it easy to see. And gray is probably not the best color, but I'm colorblind, as you know by now. Okay, let's save this and then check it out in the browser real quick here. Okay, so there you can kind of see it. Let's make it bigger. Let's set the height to 44 pixels and the width to 44 pixels. I'm choosing that number because apparently that's a good size to make a button for if you're looking at your phone. 44 pixels is apparently a good size for your finger to press on it. So that's why I chose height and width of 44px. Okay, let's set the font size to 24px. Now I may have glossed over font size in my font video, and I'm realizing that now. And we can make the font bold by setting the font weight property. So let's set that to bold. That'll make it bold. And then we'll do a few other things here. We want to align it both vertically and horizontally within within the div, we want to align that text, the character, which is text actually. So we'll do this. We'll set the line height to 44px. That's an old trick for aligning text vertically. That used to be very difficult before Flexbox, but that'll align the text vertically within this 44 pixel box. And then the other thing that we'll do is we'll set the text align to center, and that will center it horizontally. And let's see what it looks like right now. We might want to make a few more changes to it, but save that and then Alt Tab back to the browser and hit refresh. There you go. Now you can see it. All right. When I hover over it, we want people to know they can click on it. So let's go back here and we can set the cursor property. So here, set the cursor property to pointer. And now look at what that does here. Save your changes, Alt Tab back over to the browser, and when I hover over it now, it turns into a little pointer icon so that people are aware that they can click on it. So that's what the cursor property does for you there. All right, now the last thing we're going to do is make it disappear, because we don't want it here for large screens. So by default, we'll set we'll make it disappear. We'll only make it reappear when we hit the small screen size. To make it disappear, we'll set the display property to none, like that. Okay, so now if I refresh the browser, we won't see it because we set the display to none. But we do want it to appear when we hit the breakpoint. So scroll back down to your media query here, and let's target it with a rule set. Put your cursor right there and make sure you're inside the media query, but we'll target it with an ID selector, menu dash button. And all we're going to do here is set the display to block, which is what it was by default. So we're just setting it back to its default display property. So let's see what that does now. Control S to save it, and then Alt Tab back to the browser and hit refresh. It's gone now because we set the display to none, but once we hit the breakpoint, we'll see it right there. So now it's showing up right here. Okay, now it looks kind of funny. Things are kind of out of alignment here, but we'll spend a minute or two fixing all that stuff here. So I'm noticing here that there's a little bit of margin or padding right here, right above our header, and so it makes things kind of look funny right here. Now, different browsers will apply different styles to a page by default, and so we might not see this little line right here of white if we look at this in another browser. But what I want to do is we're going to set the we're going to scroll up to the very top right here, and we're going to target, let's see, what do we want to target here? Let's target the body. I think this will do it for us. And let's set the margin and padding to 0 for both of those. Margin : 0. And remember, don't forget that semicolon. And if you're setting something to 0, you don't have to specify whether it's pixels or percents or whatever, because 0 is just 0. Go ahead and set the padding to 0, like that. And now save the changes and go back to the browser and hit refresh. There we go. Okay, so now things are starting to line up more. But another thing that you might want to do for smaller screens, it's not so bad here, but sometimes the header is really tall on big screens, and you want the header to be smaller on small screens because it takes up a lot of vertical space. So we don't have a big problem with that here, but let's just address that in our media query anyways. So let's go down back to our media query here. And I think what we did is, what did we originally set the header to? The header, well, we didn't set a height, but we just let it be auto height. So anyways, let's go here and we'll target the header element inside of our media query, and we'll set the height to 44px, so it's going to be the same size as the button. Okay, save that, and then go back to the browser and hit refresh. Okay, now that got bigger, and I'm realizing something. I realize we actually applied some padding to the header. If I go back and look at our original setting for the header, we applied 20 pixels of padding. So the true height of our header is 20 pixels on the top, 44 pixels for the height that we just set, and then another 20 pixels of padding on the bottom. So that's the problem that we have with the CSS box model, is calculating the true height and width of an element. But there is a hack to fix that. So let's scroll back down to the media query here, and there's a trick that we can apply here. Remember this one? It's the border sizing, box sizing. If we set the box sizing property to border box, then what that means is if we say we want the height to be 44 pixels, it's going to make sure that the height is 44 pixels regardless of the padding. So look at what happens when we save our changes here. And now that should fix our problem. And now I can see that the header is the same height as our button, which is 44 pixels. So that's a great little trick here. Okay, we could go on, but I think we covered most of it. So the whole idea here is we want our web pages to be responsive. And what that means is that they adapt to different screen sizes. So we added a media query, and the syntax is strange for those, but inside the curly braces of the media query, you can write rules that will take effect wherever you set your breakpoint. So we set our breakpoint at 600 pixels right there. That means that once the browser hits 600 pixels or less in this case, then all of these rule sets will kick in and they'll override any that are in conflict up above. So, yeah, there you have it. Media queries are a big deal.